Good morning, everybody. If you had been in Baltimore Harbor on this date, September 13, in 1814, you would have noticed the British begin their bombardment of Fort McHenry. And it was the next day, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner. The War of 1812 had two areas of fighting. One area was up by the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie, and then another set of battles were Virginia, Maryland, and that's where our story takes place. So this is Fort McHenry today. You can see downtown Baltimore in the background. And the British plan in 1814 was to come up into the harbor and capture the city. And a month before, the Brits had burned Washington, D.C. So if Baltimore also fell, that would really hurt the American cause relative to East Coast ports. So the British plan was to be Army-Navy combination. The Army was going to go on land to that upper right, and then the Navy was going to come in the harbor. And our guys were able to stop the Army part of the attack, and then when the Navy part came, that was the big drama. That's our story. And the British were using Congreve rockets. Mr. Congreve was a British soldier who designed them, and he was inspired by rockets used in India, where the Brits were having some tension with the Indians. Here's another view of the Congreve rocket. So when Francis Scott Key talks about the rocket's red glare, he was referring to a Congreve rocket. So this painting of the attack on Fort McHenry reminds us that we had sunk ships close to the fort, and you can see the tops of those ships in the painting. So that was one reason why the Brits weren't able to get as close to the fort with their heavy guns as they wanted. Now, two flags had been made for Fort McHenry by some women in Baltimore. The big one is the one of our story, and then they also had a backup one that was a little sturdier and so on. But the big one is the one that Francis Scott Key saw. Now, why was he on this boat in Baltimore Harbor in the first place? Well, they were negotiating with Britain the return of a prisoner, and this was considered a truce ship. But because the fighting was starting, they wouldn't let him off the ship until the battle was finished, because he might have military information. So that's why he was looking at this battle in the first place. So when it was finished, they let him go, and he wrote a 4-verse poem called The Defense of Fort McHenry. It wasn't called the Star Spangled Banner, and later his brother-in-law set it to music to a British drinking song, To Anacreon in Heaven. And it was a very popular song in England and in our country too. Now, believe it or not, it was not the national anthem right away. And this is Ripley's Believe It or Not from the 1930s, where the cartoonist says, hey, believe it or not, we don't have a national anthem. And we didn't. America the Beautiful was there, My Country 'Tis of Thee. But it was in 1931 that President Hoover signed legislation creating the national anthem, and it was the Star Spangled Banner. So it wasn't the national anthem right away. Now, the flag itself was in pretty rough shape, partly because it got damaged during the fighting, but also people were starting to take snips from it as souvenirs. And eventually the flag was given to the Smithsonian, where it is today under glass in a temperature-controlled environment. It's been restored a bunch of times, and during World War II it was actually hidden in Shenandoah National Park to keep it safe. Now, this is Whitney Houston singing the Star Spangled Banner at the 1991 Super Bowl, and this is how most of us interact with the Star Spangled Banner. We hear someone sing it. It's usually performed. Maybe you've been somewhere where a child or somebody younger sang it. Originally, though, it was considered a choral song, and people would sing it in groups, but mostly we hear it sung as solos. So Francis Scott Key is buried in Frederick, Maryland. Here's his grave. A bit of a lawyer and a bit of a poet. And of course, if you go to Baltimore as a tourist, you can visit Fort McHenry, where it all happened that led to our national anthem.